it strikes me that my usual role in these events is to welcome the speaker. If I were to go ahead now and welcome myself, that would have a certain Melvillian quality to it, or maybe more like an Edgar Allan Poe quality to it. So I think I'll skip that and leave it at what Lonnie said. Now, she may have been a little optimistic, I fear, when she says, I'm going to talk for 30, 35 minutes. I'm going to aim for that. But when I start talking about Melville, it's a little hard for me to keep things under control. So I'll try not to go on too long. And I'm also conscious of the fact that this will have the feel of a lecture, I'm afraid, and that I'll be doing sort of all the talking until we get to the Q&A, which I guess can't be helped. But I'm trying to think about this as if I were talking to you, but also through you to your students. That is to say, I'm going to be making a lot of statements, some of which may seem weird, others may make sense to you. I'm hoping that as you listen and think about what I have to say, you will think in terms of turning these statements into questions for yourselves and for your students, because I'm a strong believer that the best classes work through a question and answer rhythm rather than a lecture performance. So how would you bring this remarkable story that I read at least once a year and find things in it each time that are fresh and new? How would you teach this great work to students who have probably never read anything by Melville, may never have read anything by a 19th century writer, may find some of the colloquialisms and diction difficult? So those are some of the questions that I think should be and probably are on your minds. You might think of starting, I think I would suggest being very brief with this, but you might start by pointing out to your students, most of whom have probably never read anything else by Melville, that he had only a couple of years earlier brought into the world his most famous book, Moby Dick. And even if you just read a page of that book, you'll immediately sense the voice in that book is grandiose, exuberant, operatic. It's full of itself. You know, some of the famous sentences where he writes, "Give me a condor's quill. Give me Vesuvius's inkstand." Now, if you tell them that, you're going to probably explain what Mount Vesuvius is. But the metaphor is there's nothing big enough for me to draw the ink out of that I need to write this book. To produce a mighty book, he writes in Moby Dick, you must choose a mighty theme. No great and enduring volume can ever be written on the flea, though many there are who have tried it. I would just put that Melville in, or think about putting that Melville in front of your students very briefly. You might read a passage from Moby Dick. My nominee would be the short chapter 14, called Nantucket, which is this dazzling display of his associative imagination. And whenever I read that, I read it aloud to my students. It makes me think of a great jazz musician playing a riff on a theme. You never know where it's going to go. You feel his joy in the ferment of his own imagination. So you might take a couple of minutes to convey to the students that that's sort of who Melville was just a couple of years before he wrote this story. As I hardly need to belabor the point, the tone and register of this story could not be more different. It's quiet. You could say it's depressed. It's gray. It's flat. It has a few moments of humor in it, which we'll talk about a little bit, but it sounds like a completely different voice from the Melville of Moby Dick of a couple of years earlier. And what's the point of bothering your students with that sort of information or suggestion? Well, for one thing, I think it's fair to say that Melville was a moody guy. A lot of scholars have played around with anachronistic categories like manic depression, bipolar. They're not totally off base because he has his highs and his lows. And I think we all know, alas, that many of our students are feeling a lot of mental stress and get up a lot of mornings feeling pretty dark about the world. And I think that's one way to help them connect to this great writer who we want to try to make him seem less like, a worthy in a stiff photograph and more like an actual human being struggling with the challenges of being alive, because I think that's who he was. So this story, Bartleby the Scrivener, a story of Wall Street, is a story about isolation and depression and loneliness, experiences with which, as I say, I think many of our students are all too familiar. A point to make before you plunge into it is an obvious one to many of us as English professors, if that's who you are. The I of the story, the first person narrator of the story, should not be confused in every detail with the author's I. There's clearly some distance between Melville and the figure who's telling this story. But I think there are a lot of moments when they converge, and students might be interested in that idea that one of the things writers do is to imagine themselves into what in literary theory discourse we would call the subject position of another person. And that doesn't mean that everything they write at the first person is about themselves, which of course has gotten a lot of novelists into trouble when their friends and family think they're writing about them. Okay, with some preliminaries roughly along those lines, I would plunge right into the text. I would start with the very first sentence, which is a short one. And I would say to your students up front, this is a story you believe, and I think it can be demonstrated, that every word is carefully chosen. There are no accidental words in this story. So the first line, I am a rather elderly man. Sort of unremarkable sentence, but you might pause for a moment and ask your students, now what's the deal with this word rather? It's one of those words, right? Like quite. It's a qualifier that really in a clean sentence shouldn't be there. It doesn't add or subtract much from the sentence, but it's the first hint to tell us a little bit about the sensibility and personality of the speaker in this story. This is a guy who is not that enthusiastic about making assertions. He's not putting his views out there. He wants to he's careful. He wants to surround himself with qualifications. And we learn some more things about him very early in those early passages. He refers to his employé rather than his employees, which tells us, he's got some pretension. He uses this foreign sounding phrase. Why? To impress the reader, or because he's used to trying to impress the people whom he deals with. So we begin to learn some not insignificant things about this guy in the very first paragraphs of the story. You might go out on a limb and say maybe he's got a status anxiety problem or a self-confidence problem. And you might pause then and see if your students want to talk a little bit about what one can tell from the way people speak. What we learn about people from the words they choose, and maybe the words they avoid. And I suspect your students have a lot of opinions about that, and it might even encourage them to think a little bit about themselves in that respect. And then we get to another point of information that the narrator shares with us, that he was not unemployed by the late John Jacob Astor. Who was John Jacob Astor? Your students will want to know. You could throw something into the discussion that might enliven it, and you could say, well, he was sort of the Donald Trump of the early 19th century, at least in the sense that he was a big real estate developer in New York. And the narrator goes on to say, I'm not insensible to Mr. Astor's good opinion. You might pause on that and ask, so what's going on with these double negatives? Any good writing teacher will discourage students from using double negatives. And why do we say double negatives are not a good way to make an argument or make a point? Because they seem to be cautious, evasive. I mean, they add up to a positive, right? I was employed by John Jacob Astor, and I like the fact that he liked me. But this guy is not willing to come out and say that stuff. Why? Worrying, would that sound vain? Would it sound like I'm bragging? So he wants the point out there, but he wants to put it out there in this way that's protective of himself. So chances are, if you follow anything like this approach to the beginning of the story, your students are not going to have a great first impression of this narrator. I'm not describing a person with terribly attractive characteristics so far, at least I don't think I am. So we can pause with that, kind of leave it hanging as to whether we've established who this guy is. And then you might turn to Melville's physical description of the office itself, where the action, such as it is, of the story takes place. And I think if you have your students read closely the description of the office, and you point out the subtitle of the story, a story of Wall Street, again, no accidents here, I think. This is a claustrophobic place, right? As I recall, the lawyer himself is sitting in a part of the office where there's a brick wall 10 feet away, which is a great luxury. Whereas when Bartleby arrives, he puts him in a spot where the window, there's only 3 feet between the window and the brick wall across the alleyway. And most of you don't teach students in New York City, but I do. And I find that my students kind of get that and realize that unless you're an extremely wealthy person, there's no way in Manhattan to have a window either in your office or your home that has a really open vista into the world. You're much more likely, if you're a person of limited means, to have the kind of view that he has. And this is an ancillary point, which you don't have to spend time on, but I like to remind my students that the New York of 1850, which this story is set, felt as a sensory experience, I think very much like the New York of today. The population obviously was much lower. There weren't gas internal combustion engine vehicles driving around, but most of the population was crammed into lower Manhattan, where off of Wall Street, where this office is, and the density of that population in that more limited area was probably comparable to what we experience today. And given the cobblestone streets, it was probably noisier. And given the fact that these tenement buildings were up close against each other, it felt at least as crowded and airless as it does now. Melville has a wonderful way, and this is one of those moments I said earlier where I think the Melville and the eye of the story sort of converge in the language. There's a wonderful way of describing the view through the window, which I love. He says it is deficient in what landscape painters call life. Now that's coming from Melville. That's not coming from this lawyer, I don't think. Deficient in what landscape painters call life raises a whole host of questions. What do we mean by life? Is the life of nature without people in the picture real life? Or is there more real life going on inside this claustrophobic space? Perhaps, but that's not likely, certainly not what early 19th century landscape painters were interested in painting. Later painters began to paint such scenes. You could, there's sort of an Edward Hopper feeling to this story, for example. Okay, so you give them a little flavor of the space, And then you get to the characters. So who are these people? What is their job? They are copyists. And that, I would surmise, requires a little explanation. I and some of you are old enough to remember certain fairly primitive technologies of copying. Like when I was in grade school, we had mimeograph machines, and I still remember the smell of that liquid that put into them, and the blueprint that came out on the rolls of wet paper. That was our way of making copies. Then we had carbon paper in our typewriters, so that when you type one sheet, you actually created two sheets. And then, of course, along came the Xerox machine, which was a huge technological breakthrough. And now we have all this digital technology that we can send infinite numbers of copies of documents around the world in a flash. Your students are living in the world of the last version. The mimeograph machine and the carbon paper is ancient history to them. They've probably never heard of them. And they certainly never heard of a law office where you had to employ full-time human workers to make copies of documents with ink and pen, and relying on their ability to make accurate transcriptions of what the original has to say. You might pause and ask your students to think about what kind of work, what that kind of work feels like. Not, I think, very fulfilling, I suspect. These people, to put it anachronistically, are human Xerox machines. And so it's not altogether surprising when we begin to learn more about them that they're having a little trouble, keeping up their enthusiasm for a full workday about what they are employed to do. So we meet Turkey, right? This short, elderly Englishman who's kind of red-faced. Well, he's okay in the morning. He's functional in the morning. He does his job without complaint, quietly, efficiently. But by the afternoon, he's become red-faced, and he's dripping ink all over the place. That's another thing you might have to point out to your students. They're using quill pens, right? Fountain pens, as we sort of know them. And you got to do a careful job of blotting the ink. Otherwise, you're going to have ink splotches all over the document, which are going to obscure the words on the page. So he starts dripping ink all over everything. You'll have to tell them when Melville refers to the sandbox, that he's not talking about the box that children play in, but the little box on the desk that is used to aid in the ink blotting process. But we learn that this guy is essentially a part-time employee, because he functions in the morning, but by the afternoon, as I've been saying, he becomes useless. And his employer says at one point, says, you know what, you really don't need to stay after lunch. You can go home, but he doesn't quite say, because you're not any good to me, but save your energy, come back tomorrow morning. So we learn a couple of things here. For one thing, I suspect that Melville is implying that this guy is drinking, which is one way to cope with his anxiety about his life and his working life, and perhaps his life beyond his working life, which we don't know anything about. And we also get the first hint that this pompous, status conscious guy that we described earlier is actually pretty tolerant and thoughtful and willing to think about his employees as people, because he's supposed to get a full day's work out of this guy, but he is kind of willing to accept that that's not going to happen. Now, his counterpart, Nippers, is a young man, and he's got the opposite thing going on, right? In the morning, he's totally out of control. He's grinding his teeth. He's sort of cursing under his breath. He can't get comfortable at his desk, which you should remind your students is a standing desk, which has come back somewhat into fashion these days. as some people think it's better for your back, but in those days it was the norm. So he's constantly moving the desk around. He's putting little bits of paper under the legs of the desk to try to stabilize it the way the waiter does in the restaurant when your table is wobbling and your wine glass is spilling. He's just a very jumpy, we would say, neurotic guy. And he gets mysterious visitors who pop into the office periodically and hand him documents which he claims are official this or official that. But the lawyer suspects that these are people to whom he owes money. So he's a mess in the morning, but the lawyer says of Nippers, I think he's a temperate young man, which is 19th century lingo for he probably does not drink. I'm not sure that's a correct assumption, but maybe. And by the afternoon, he's more functional than Turkey is. So what it adds up to is you've got two full-time employees two half-time workers who add up to one full-time employee for the reasons that I've been describing. And then we get another Melvillian sentence that I think comes from him more than perhaps the lawyer. Their fits relieved each other like guards. It's a beautifully compressed simile. The one guard is in charge of the watch in the morning, the other guard is in charge in the afternoon. They're never really working together. Now, I'll skip over Ginger Nut, the young kid who runs errands and brings the little bits of cake back to the office. And we'll get to the third and the central, most interesting employee. So we learn that the lawyer's business is growing. And these two copyists, therefore, especially since they only add up to one, are not enough to handle his business. So he puts out an ad for another employee, and into the story walks Bartleby, this quiet, cadaverous young man who seems to have the right credentials to get the job. And we get a little more physical description now of the office, which is that until Bartleby's arrival, there had been two sections to this office divided by ground glass doors, opaque glass doors of the kind students will be familiar with from, say, the bathroom window. And the two, Turkey and Nippers, are on one side and the boss is on the other side. Now with the arrival of Bartleby, he tells us that he decides to put Bartleby in his own space with him, right by that window with the 3-foot view of the brick wall. But he puts up a high folding green screen. Why? Because he doesn't want to see him. He doesn't want to have to look at him. But he does want to be, he wants Bartleby to be able to hear him when he's called. Melville sums this situation up in another fantastic phrase. Thus, in a manner, privacy and society were conjoined. Privacy and society were conjoined. There's a wicked wit going on here. It makes it sound like some kind of drawing room situation where everybody has what they want, a little privacy, a little society, whereas in fact, of course, it's the removal of this employee out of sight and the desire to have him at his beck and call. Okay, now we approach the dramatic moment that turns the story about, it's a descriptive piece of writing as I've been describing it so far. It has some psychological elements in it, but suddenly, very suddenly, and very amazingly, it becomes a psychological, guess you could say, but also suddenly a moral drama. And that happens, as we all know, when in the ordinary course of events, as the routine business of such an office, the lawyer asks Bartleby to compare one of the copies with the original, which is kind of the essence of the job, right? And Bartleby replies with that Now, world famous response, I would prefer not to. I would prefer not to, which Melville has him repeat 3 times on the same page. It's a gentle, non-confrontational comment. It doesn't have anger in it. It's not belligerent. But the lawyer is completely knocked over by this and talks about how he has to rally his stunned faculties. And after he kind of recovers from the blow, he keeps after Bartleby in a gentle, reasonable way, and asks him to do his job, please. And then the debate begins, and it extends over several pages. The lawyer gets to the point of actually asking Bartleby, why do you refuse? Which again is beginning to complicate the portrait of this narrator, I think, because there are a lot of people, and I think a lot of your students might take this view, who would say, look, once Bartleby has said, I prefer not to 3 or 4 times, it's time for him to go. He's a new employee. The last hired, first fired kind of thing could apply here. But no, the lawyer actually wants to probe and try to understand what's going on with this guy and why he is giving him this response. And they get into a discussion about why he's preferring not to and why he needs to do what he's being asked to do. And the best the lawyer can come up with in that back and forth is when he says to him, you need to do this, that's paraphrasing now, but this is quotation, because it is common usage. It is common usage. So what's going on here, I think, is that this meek, bizarre character is compelling his employer to articulate the reason why what goes on in that office is reasonable to go on. And the best he can come up with is to say it's common usage, which we could translate into saying, because this is the way we do things. This is the way we've always done things. And when I get to that point in the story, I'm an inveterate anecdotalist, and I talk too much about myself, I fear, in some of my classes. But it reminded me not when I first read it, but when I read it after a certain number of years, of the occasion when we were moving from Boston to New York, and we took our then 5-year-old son to a Peter, Paul and Mary concert. And Peter, Paul and Mary were pretty getting on in years by then. And remember how they used to do a monologue? Each one of them would do a separate monologue before a given song. And I don't remember which song it was. Mary does her thing and is talking about it. And she said something like, I realized that, the 60s were behind us and I had changed when my daughter asked me why I have to do this or why I can't do that. And her mother replied, because I said so, which is like the ultimate curse phrase of the 60s, right? There's nothing behind it except an acknowledgement of tradition, routine, and unproven authority, because I said so. That's basically what the lawyer is left with as his best explanation to Bartleby. And I do take the opportunity at this point when I teach the story of carrying it outward into history and into larger public issues. And I'm not saying this is the right way to do it or the right way for you to do it, but I'm just sharing something I find myself naturally feeling that I can do. I talk about how one of the ways to think about the evolution of society or historical change is to think about how some procedures or some assumptions are assumed to be normal, common usage, and then some event happens or some pressure breaks through, and what was ordinary and common suddenly seems bizarre and indefensible. And you can suggest some of the obvious examples. It was common usage for most of human history for women to be subservient to men. It was common usage in much of American history, at least in the South and large measure also in the North, for blacks and whites to live separately in the sense that Black people couldn't eat at the same lunch counter or go to the same school. It was common usage until very recently that only heterosexual couples could get married. And when those social assumptions of what was true and right were challenged, they either slowly or quickly broke down because they appeared under pressure to be completely irrational and indefensible. Now, if that seems totally anachronistic, I would read out the following sentence to your students, or ask them to read it aloud, having presumably read it before class, where the lawyer says of himself, "Nothing so aggravates an earnest person as a passive resistance." Nothing so aggravates an earnest person as a passive resistance. And you don't have to make the leap to Dr. King or to Gandhi when you make the point that what Bartleby is engaged in is a kind of nonviolent resistance. Because, of course, Dr. King and Gandhi both look to Henry David Thoreau's famous essay on civil disobedience, which first appeared in its first form in 1849. And though I don't know that there's direct evidence that Melville read it, he certainly knew that this idea was in the air. Civil disobedience, passive resistance, nonviolent resistance, whatever you prefer to call it. You can also start, I think, to describe the relationship between Bartleby and his employer as one in which one party is engaged in what we would call in modern psychological lingo, passive aggression. Bartleby doesn't get angry, he doesn't get belligerent, as I said earlier. He just quietly says, "I prefer not to." And you might ask your students, and I said at the very beginning, there are no accidental words in the story. Why doesn't Melville have him say no? Or more colloquially, perhaps, up yours or stuff it. Doesn't say anything like that. He says, "I prefer not to." And I think it can be valuable to talk with your students about what's the effect of that choice, to put it that way. The effect of that choice, to answer my rhetorical question, but in a good class, you'd hope that the students would respond to the question, is that it puts the onus on the person who's asking. It forces the person who's asking to explain himself, which was, of course, the genius of passive resistance in the political sphere. And it only works with certain, it doesn't work with the most brutal possessors of power, who won't engage in the dialogue at all, just sweep you away. But the bet that the passive resistor makes, at least in Anglo-American cultural history, is that there's enough of a self-awareness and reflectiveness in the person who holds the power that by challenging them, you might compel some rethinking of the legitimacy of what's going on here. Now that's a political way of describing it. A psychological way of describing it is, and I think your students will not have difficulty, as we said in the 60s anyway, relating to this. The lawyer finds himself dealing with a passive aggressive personality. And he just captures that in another fantastic sentence that I think few writers could write. He says, "I might as well have essayed to strike fire with my knuckles against a bit of Windsor soap. Windsor is obviously a brand of soap we don't have anymore, but the metaphor is pretty vivid, I think, still today. Rubbing your knuckles, you can do it from now till the end of time against a soft piece of soap, and you won't get a spark out of it. That's what it's like with a passive-aggressive personality, right? You can't bring them out of that state of mind. Okay, now to carry the story, I think, where it goes, or to follow the story where it goes, the lawyer sort of needs some fresh air after these encounters he's having with this unmanageable but meek and quiet employee, and he goes out into the world. He goes, as he does every Sunday, to church in the morning, to Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan. And he gets there early one Sunday. So he's got some time on his hands, and he goes around to his office, which is just a few steps away. And when he puts his key in the door, he finds it's blocked by a key from the inside, and he discovers that Bartleby is there. And Bartleby kind of peers out the door and says, "Look, I don't want to be, not right now. I prefer not to be disturbed right now." So the lawyer's bewildered, presumably goes back and hears the sermon. Then he goes back around to his office, and he goes in. Now Bartleby is absent for the moment, and he discovers that he's living there, right? He's sleeping there. He finds the little bits of cheese and cracker and bits of the ginger nut cake that Ginger Nut brings around in the desk drawer. And he suddenly, he has a moment where suddenly something like the reality of Bartleby's life breaks through into his careful, cautious, conventional, I don't want any trouble, I don't cause any trouble kind of sensibility. And he comes and he realizes that he's got what we would call a homeless person on his hands, and a person living in poverty and living entirely and utterly alone. And this, I think, speaks again to the lawyer about whom I started out making harsh comments. This guy has some ability to respond to human experience and indeed to human suffering. For the first time in my life, a feeling of overpowering, stinging melancholy seized me. The bond of a common humanity now drew me irresistibly to gloom. For both I and Bartleby were sons of Adam. You know, there's a vast gulf between them socially and economically, but he has suddenly seen in him a human brother. I remembered the bright silks and sparkling faces I had seen that day in gala trim, swan-like, sailing down the Mississippi of Broadway. And I contrasted them with the pallid copyist and thought to myself, ah, happiness courts delight. So we deem the world as gay, but misery hides aloof. So we deem that misery, there is none. If we don't see it, we don't want to know it. He wanted him behind the screen, but he has stepped in front of the screen. These sad fancying chimeras, doubtless of a sick and silly brain, he says hopefully, led on to other and more special thoughts concerning Bartleby. Presentiments of strange discoveries hovered round me. The Scrivener's pale form appeared to me laid out among uncaring strangers in its shivering winding sheet. So suddenly Bartleby has become an emblem of human suffering, of loneliness and isolation, and ultimately death itself. couple pages later, the sentence, he seemed alone, absolutely alone in the universe, a bit of wreck in the mid-Atlantic. And those of you who've read Moby Dick will know that Melville evokes in several places the unutterable loneliness of the abandoned sailor, in the case of Moby Dick, a black sailor, Pip, abandoned and bobbing lonely in the immensity of the open ocean. And this is the emotion that I think he brings to this passage, even though it's set in the city in an entirely different context from what is sea tales. So when he has this revelation, he becomes obsessed with Bartleby, right? He walks down the street and he has an experience that I think we all have and your students will have had. He's got something on his mind, namely Bartleby. He walks by a couple of people chatting on the street corner. He overhears a fragment of their conversation. They say something like, you know, I bet he's going to go. And he assumes they're talking about Bartleby, whereas of course they're talking about something entirely different. So suddenly his whole world is revolving around Bartleby. And I think your students can understand what's going on here psychologically. He starts to try to reason with him. You know, what earthly right have you to stay here? He says he wants to give him severance pay and suggests that he go out and find another job. You can't stay here. Do you pay any rent? Do you pay my taxes? Is this property yours? And he gets nowhere. He only gets the passive aggressive response. We've all had that kind of experience with somebody, and it's most painful when it's somebody close to us, a spouse, a child, a parent, a roommate, a friend. Your students will have all had some such experience. And so the question that begins to press in on the lawyer is a moral question, and that is, in my view, where does my responsibility for this man start and where does it stop? How far do I have to go with him? And some of your students will say, and this can make for a very lively class, some of your students, I suspect, will say, kick him out. You know, there's somebody else waiting for the same job. And this guy's got a responsibility to run his firm efficiently and make sure it's productive, meet the bottom line. Bartleby is a drag on that. I'm sorry, but goodbye. So, and that's a defensible answer from a certain perspective. But the narrator in this story is having trouble with that, which is presumably sort of the way he was looking at the world before Bartleby arrived, although he seemed already to have the potentiality to look at it differently. I'll skip quickly to the end, and I'm trying to minimize the plot summary here because you've all read it. You don't need me to tell you what happens. He finally resolves the problem by deciding that rather than kick him out, rather than make an active, aggressive move against him, he's going to leave him there and he's going to move out himself, go take up another space. So the old space is rented to another business person, and the lawyer is hoping, you know, the story of Bartleby is over. And then one day, the guy who's taken up a lease in the old space shows up in his new office and says, hey, I mean, paraphrasing here, you know, we had a deal, you signed a contract that said you would leave, as we would say today, you would leave the premises broom clean. Well, actually, you left a person there who's living there. So, you know, what am I supposed to do with this guy? And the lawyer wants to evade this issue, and the new tenant says to him, not, I think, consciously reaching to the larger moral issue, but just to the immediate legal issue, but the sentence vibrates between the legal and the moral. Sir, you are responsible for the man you left there. You are responsible for the man you left there. So I would say, and I do say to my students, ultimately, this is a story is about many things, and I hope I've touched on a few of its many dimensions. And to me, is amazing how many there are in such a short space. But ultimately, I think this is a story, I guess I said earlier, that raises the question of where does one's responsibility begin and where does it end toward our fellow human beings? And you could contextualize that if you're a historian or your students are interested in history, or even if they're not, they should be. You could contextualize that into the world of the United States of 1850, where, of course, that particular question centered on the issue of slavery. What was the responsibility of non-slave owners in the North toward the victims of slave owning in the South? Is one form of that question. My students here at Columbia, I often say to them when we get to the end of our discussion of this story, I say, look, you're going to go out off campus now, you're going to walk onto the street, and between 116th Street and 110th Street, you're going to encounter 12 or 15 Bartlebys. And they're going to be in different modes of misery. And you're going to decide what to do. Mostly we, and I don't hold myself up as a paragon, mostly we walk past them. Maybe we give them a quarter. Maybe we give them $1. Maybe we work in the soup kitchen on Sundays. We all come to some kind of accommodation as to what, if any, are our responsibilities toward these people. We say we pay taxes and it's up to the city to deal with it. There are no right and wrong answers to this question, which is one of the problems with literature, why maybe it occupies an uneasy place in the modern university, but they're important questions. And they are all raised in this story. There's humor in the story, which I usually try to get to, lightens the atmosphere a little bit in the classroom when we find the lawyer saying to Bartleby kind of desperately, listen, can't you want to do something else? I have an idea. Why don't you hire yourself or get hired by some young gentleman as a traveling companion and go with him to Europe, and you can entertain him with your excellent conversation. I'm not too likely that he would get that job. And he even asked him if he wants to come home with him. There's a strong religious theme in the story too. He makes reference to the old Adam and the new Adam. And I think the implication is that he understands, probably for the first time, and this is why he says that as he's had this experience of grasping who Bartleby is, he says of himself that he had become disinclined for church going for the moment. He wasn't interested in hearing any more platitudinous sermons from the guy in Trinity Church, because he has come to understand that, in fact, the demand of Christianity, in which he professes to believe, and all the people around him profess to believe, the demand is to live and act toward this person as Christ would have us do, would have him do, which would mean give up everything. Take him in, give him succor and sanctuary, turn your entire life upside down, and devote yourself to the alleviation of his suffering. And this is something he part of him is going in that direction, but he can't bring himself to go the full distance. And I think we can hardly blame him. How many of us would or do? And I think students could relate to that question. Finally, he finds him in the tombs. He finds that he dies in the tombs. He invokes the book of Job. He sleeps with kings and counselors. And then the story ends with that extraordinary sort of epigraph where he says he hears this rumor about the dead letter office. And I ask my students, so what's a dead letter office? And some of them will look it up and tell you. It's the place where letters, where the addressees could not be found, and the letters go into storage for eternity, never to reach their destination. A love letter, a forgiveness letter, a letter full of emotion and need on the part of the letter writer that never gets to the recipient, because the recipient is gone in one way or another. And we're left with the question at the end of the story. There's no answer to it. Is that in fact the case with Bartleby? Is that why he is the way he is? Because he worked in the dead letter office and the experience was so overwhelming to him and he took it so much to heart that he became this desolate figure? Or is this just a kind of reach for an explanation of how a person can turn out this way? And you might say, if you want to encourage your students to read more Melville, you might point out to them that much of his writing is about people like Bartleby who have been scarred by some experience earlier in their lives. Ahab, most obviously, Mr. Claggart and Billy Budd. Melville seemed obsessed with trauma, we would call it today. PTSD, we might call it today. Maybe that's what Bartleby is suffering from. Okay, I've talked, as I feared, way beyond my 35 minutes. Technically, we got 5 minutes left in this part of the session. Lonnie, I'm going to hope that you can channel questions to me if there are some. And if not, we can go directly into the second portion of this session, which is to talk in the here and now, nuts and bolts about the Cornerstone Initiative. But I'm happy to stay on and respond to anything that might be on some of your minds.
Thank you, Andy, for that. There are a couple questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them as quickly as we can before we transition to the next segment of the workshop. So Andy, Brian Argenbright asks, as a new director of general education, I'm working with faculty on reforming our gen ed program to include more common readings. Listening to your talk, Brian asks if you have any thoughts on best practices to encourage reluctant faculty members who might feel stretched teaching outside their field or who might not feel up to the task of teaching challenging texts.
Right. Well, look, it's a great question. It's a key question, sort of the keystone question of our whole initiative. The best answer I can give is that I've tried to, I don't want to say model or exemplify, that's pretentious, self-serving, but I've tried to show that if you care about the text, this is not beyond the reach of anybody. It's not beyond the reach of our students, any students who have the will to learn. That's a sine qua non. And it's not beyond the reach of any teacher, regardless of what their specialty is. This story is accessible. It's transparent. It's complex. It can go in lots of different directions, but people can have rich and passionate conversations about this story. So how do you persuade faculty to teach a text like this? I think the best way to do it is to talk with them about it. That's the purpose of the teaching workshops that we're having here online for Cornerstone faculty, and that we believe in every Cornerstone program and in every individual campus. Part of the success of the program will depend on faculty being willing to come together, listen to a presentation by a colleague who may be more comfortable with the text than other people are, and sort of have a class, have a faculty class, have a class of your own that charges your batteries for the activity of teaching the text to the students. So, you know, that's the best I can do about it. You don't want to just say, hey, here's Bartleby, go teach it. It might work for some people, but it'd be much better if they can have an experience with the text along with colleagues before they go into the room to teach it. And that's, I guess, what we have in mind with these workshops and why we're recording them and why they are available to you to use in the future.
Thanks, Andy. A question from Damien Youngerman. If you were to choose one of Melville's short stories, would you choose Bartleby over, for example, Benito Cereno or Billy Budd? And can you tell us why?
Hi, Damien. It's wonderful to have you with us. I think I would choose Bartleby as a first introduction to Melville. Again, I'm not going to, you know, I hope I've shown why I think it's accessible and why it connects to young people quite directly if you give it half a chance. both Benito Cereno and Billy Budd are great masterpieces in their own very different ways, but I think they're much more challenging. So I would start with Bartleby, and then I would move on to those later. Well, Benito Cereno is much later. I would move on to those other works if and when you want to do more Melville, which I think is always a good thing to do.
And then Andy, we have two questions about sort of interpretations of the Bartleby story. So John Wells he wonders if you could say anything more about how you address religion in the story. He explains that he's always taught the story as a narrator's effort to understand an enigma that doesn't fit his safe world. And he tends to emphasize how the narrator uses religion in his efforts to decipher that enigma. And the narrator's denials of any connection to Bartleby at the end of the story seem to echo Peter's denial of Jesus. And so is there something here that you lift up for your students, and how do you sort of address religious themes in the story, and what are your strategies for talking through that with your students today?
Those comments are very apt, and I tried to just sort of gesture in that direction by suggesting that one of the things that the encounter with Bartleby does for the lawyer is open up in his mind the distinction between the formal religion that he's been participating in as a good New York City middle class, or maybe even upper middle class, a churchgoer, maybe even has a spot in the pew that he rents in his name. That's religion in one sense, but the scriptural religion that he makes reference to when he speaks about the new Adam is another thing, and they don't always go together very well. So in fact, as Melville says, he loses his taste for organized religion as a result of this experience, and finds himself confronting the question of whether he is actually a sincere Christian and what it means to be a sincere Christian. Now, I'm leery of making that the overall organizing structure for discussion of the story with students, because we don't know much about their own religious commitments. It's not, in some level, our business to know it. They're free to bring it into the discussion if they want to. But I think it's there. I think it's in the story, and it reflects Melville's view, as he shared with his contemporaries like Emerson and Thoreau, that the essence of Christianity was no longer expressed through the institutional forms of his time. And students, I think, could probably by and large relate to that anxiety as well.
Andy, a question from Daniel Cullen. Do you think Melville himself is wrestling with the dilemma of the narrator, or that Melville has somehow resolved it to his satisfaction and indicates it by portraying the discomfort of the lawyer? And do you think the answer points more towards a societal reform or an individual reform?
I think in that question, there was a question of whether Melville had resolved the problem to his satisfaction, and I can give a short, direct answer to that. Melville never resolved any problem to his satisfaction, except perhaps literary problems, and it's a problem of literary form. Melville, which, you know, he was like Picasso, he experimented with a different form in every book. But Melville, the deeper human questions that are at stake in this story were never resolved in Melville's mind, which is why he was such a tormented soul, and which is why he drove everybody around him kind of crazy. And if you want to get a better authority on that than me, you should have a look at the passage in Nathaniel Hawthorne's English notebooks, where he writes about the experience of wandering over the sands with Melville and realizing what a restless and questing soul he had, which was, of course, why he was a great writer and also a human being who was difficult to everyone, including to himself. You're muted, Lonnie, I'm afraid.
Sorry, thanks, Andy. A question from Bradley Best. He asks for your thoughts on types of writing prompts or assignments that are accessible to students from a wide range of majors and disciplines and that stimulate the sort of transformative thinking and effect that we're all seeking.
Good question, and I don't have a good quick answer. I mean, there are a lot of possibilities here. You know, one thing that's fun is to ask students to try to write something in the style of. So, you know, you might experiment with the idea of having a student write, say, a letter in the voice of the lawyer to try to capture some of those elements that I was talking about earlier. Or, you know, you might just take the bull by the horns and ask them to write a short response to the question like, what should he have done with Bartleby? And what arguments would you bring to bear to make the case about what he should have done? But I don't have a list of prompts for this story. It's been a while since I taught it in a formal class, so I don't have a list of paper topics, but I hope I've conveyed the sense that it wouldn't be hard to find a question that students would be interested in.
And then Andy, two similar questions from Lucille Bruce and John Shillow. I'm asking for suggestions for other short stories from the 19th or early 20th century that encompass mental health themes such as homelessness, trauma, PTSD, alcoholism, or addiction. And suggestions for texts by other authors that you think would set up for a nice comparison to Bartleby.
Wow, well, that's a good question, and I wish I had advance notice so I could give a better answer. I'll say off the top of my head, a story that has come into the canon in recent years, what I think works well is the Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper, The Yellow Wallpaper, which is also about an individual in mental distress. It's about a woman, it's by a woman. So I think it's useful to bring in, as we all agree, diverse voices. There are some stories in W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, which is really a collection of essays and stories like The Coming of John, that I think could open up your students toward some of these themes in the context of the African-American experience. If you're looking for stories about mental stress and you want to stick with Melville's contemporaries, of course, you can go to Poe, the Cask of Amontillado, William Wilson, which is about a guy who's really split in his consciousness and imagines that he's got a double who's tormenting him and following him around the world and has a powerful dreamlike quality that I think students have probably had some experience with. So there are a lot of stories, and we can be in touch, and I can put my head together with other people and maybe we can suggest a little bit of an anthology. That's one of the things we're thinking and talking about on the Cornerstone Initiative, is whether we should collaborate with all of you and try to gather information about which works have worked best in the class and pull them together into some kind of maybe digitally available reading anthology with some commentary either written or spoken attached to them. So thank you for the question, and we'll try to follow up.